Hard Hat's all about showing up to play hard, doing what it takes to win.
If you want to cement legacy, win another.
He's your third center.
You don't want to pump him up too much, but it's hard not to.
This is maybe the most I've ever agreed with you.
Hey, Buddy Manning here. Welcome to a Monday edition of the Garden Report. Michael Scotto in the house. We've been trying to get him on here for a while, and finally get to talk to you here, Michael. And good timing, too. You were in the house in Brooklyn over the weekend when Kristaps Porzingis made his return, and I know you guys down in New York still have some love in KP, love for KP in your hearts, and it's been interesting to watch this last 2 years with him in Boston. I was saying the other day, if you said he was going to miss this many games with Boston when the trade happened, probably would have been a failure. But it's actually been a success.
I mean, my thing, well, Bobby, it's funny when you're saying, we have a lot of love. I probably have more love for Kristaps Porzingis than the Knicks fans. I'll say that. But big picture, yeah. I mean, I get what you're saying about him missing games, but at the end of the day, Porzingis showed up when it mattered most in the playoffs, finals. I know he got hurt for a little bit there, but and even the other day, just coming back, dropping, I think it was like 24 points in 32 minutes against Brooklyn. He was sensational. And when KP's healthy and right, he gives Boston a high level of rim protection, and he can spread the floor well to give Jason Tatum, Jaylen Brown, and Drew Holiday driving lanes. So he's been a great piece for them. And, credit to Brad Stevens for bringing him in here, and for KP, allowing him to kind of add to his legacy, certainly winning a title. And, hopefully for him, his goal, just catching up with him the other day, obviously try to get another one back to back.
Yeah, and it was the most KP thing ever in some ways. He had the injury in the playoffs that no one ever heard of. Then this month, the illness that they couldn't figure out what it was. And you were there, I think, in the locker room as he tried to describe what it was and all the tests and this and that. And it still feels like going forward, there might be some ups and downs in the recovery here. So we'll see if he's active again on Tuesday against Brooklyn here in Boston as the two teams meet up again, and what his availability looks like the rest of the schedule here. But it was such a strange process. He played one game, I believe, against Toronto, or missed a game against Toronto with that illness, came back the next night against Detroit, and then missed the next 9 games through the Lakers game and everything else. And as he said yesterday, he wanted to come back for the Lakers game, but just couldn't. And it still doesn't totally feel like they know what went wrong with him there in terms of that illness.
Yeah, look, in general, the entire winter season, whether it was the flu or something, it was just brutal for a lot of people in the NBA. So for KP, we were touching on that when he was in Brooklyn at Barclays Center. And the biggest thing for KP was after the game, he wasn't feeling as winded and like he needed to go lay down and go to bed. So he's gotten more of his stamina back. And ultimately for him going forward, that's going to be the biggest thing, obviously, making sure that he can build up his stamina and reps going towards the playoffs. In some ways, I always say this for players going into the playoffs. If you can come back before the playoffs, get games in under your belt, and you kind of rest up and save your body a little bit for the playoffs, you usually should be fresher. And in a way, I know for the Knicks, for example, with Jalen Brunson being hurt, it's a blow for them in the immediate future. But going into the playoffs, as long as he's, knock on wood, healthy and able to come back, it's going to be a huge lift for him to come back fresh. Because we all know certainly the Knicks get monitored a lot with Tom Thibodeau and the minutes police.
Yeah, and they were wondering too with Porzingis in this game how many minutes he could go, and Joe's like 32. He went right up to 31, played the full fourth quarter, and that was the most impressive thing I thought about the game there. And there were a couple things. Obviously, the shooting percentage inside the arc, 8 and 9, was just ridiculous in there, especially early in the fourth quarter of that game. Linking up with Drew Holiday, it gives them that inside presence as you talk about, which they don't really have when he's not there. And it's still amazing to look back at the playoffs a year ago, and I'm like, oh, they're going to really miss him here when he went down against Miami. But they get through round one. They get through round 2 in 5 games, obviously against an injured Cavs team, and then they see the Pacers in the East Finals instead of the Knicks there after, New York just completely crumbled injury-wise. So I guess they got a softer path than they could have there on the way to the finals, but it still amazes me, and KP missed most of the NBA Finals too, that they were able to get through that whole run pretty much without him the whole way. And just looking at them this year, a couple guys having down seasons, Horford being another year older, I don't think that's going to be the case this year. I think they're going to need Porzingis to repeat, to be pretty much available for almost all the games through the run here.
Well, I'll say this about Boston going into the playoffs this year. When you look at the Knicks and the Cavaliers, they loaded up on trying to get bigger wings to try to combat Tatum and Brown. So Cleveland goes out and gets DeAndre Hunter. They lose Karis LeVert, George Niang as part of the deal. But the same thing with the Knicks. They go get Mikal Bridges, try to pair him with OG Anunoby, and try to have this wing stop diversity. So to your point, look, Al Horford, I got to give the guy credit. He's been still productive at his age. And I certainly think he can give you a good 25 minutes a night. But for KP, yeah, he's certainly an X factor for them. When KP got there, it just seemed like it took that Boston starting five to a whole new level and an elite level. And truthfully, it's why a lot of people around the league going into the playoffs still believe Boston can come out of the East. Cleveland's been impressive. I think ultimately you're going to see Cleveland and Boston going at it in the Eastern Conference Finals with a shot to the finals. And you saw Boston go up against OKC recently, who a lot of people are looking at in the West and wondering if this is their year, even though they're younger. So for Boston, to me, KP's the X factor, no question. His shooting ability opens up the driving lanes for Tatum and Brown, and his shot blocking at the rim is something they generally don't have for an extended period of time when he's not on the court.
Yeah, and you mentioned the New York thing. That could be another fun layer here too, because those two teams are on a collision course. The Knicks, the Celtics, they almost got it last year in the East Finals, which would have been perfect because it felt like the Knicks had some momentum and played the Celtics tough last year. But with KP on that other side and the 3 games we watched to start this year, and they're going to have another one at MSG coming up next month that I'm looking forward to. Hopefully it'll mean a little something because both teams look pretty much locked at this point.
However that series goes, it's going to be a grind out game, and Tibbs and the Knicks are going to squeeze every ounce of effort out of the Celtics, especially when Tibbs is probably playing his starters close to 40 minutes, especially in the playoffs. We saw it last year. This year, you look at again, they built that starting five, and that's including in my mind kind of Mitch Robinson there to combat Boston. That is the whole thing about once you win and you're the champ, everybody's trying to knock you off. And so all the teams in the East, and Cleveland and New York, like I touched on, they made these moves to try to get bigger and have more size all throughout their starting five against Boston. So like you touched on it, Bobby, KP is certainly, I think you said it, like he's needed more than maybe the last run that they had. I can agree with your assessment on that when you look at how the top teams in the East restructured their rosters to get better.
Yeah, and that's the weird thing. The Knicks made all those moves to match the Celtics. You thought that they were going to restructure their roster there to have a better shot to beat Boston. And in the games we've watched so far, they've looked further away. And for whatever reason that is, obviously they're dealing with some injuries now and have been for a lot of the season. You mentioned the minutes thing there too. They're just in such a weird place where, and I don't know how people are talking about them down there in New York, but they're having this season that's probably the best they've had in a long time. And it's probably their most legitimately contending level roster that they've had in a long time. But you have those 3 games against Boston where they didn't look close to being able to beat Boston in a single game, never mind a series. And now, I'm reading all this stuff about Mikal Bridges talking about the minutes, and yet Hart and Thibodeau in a shouting match in the timeout huddle there. And, all my Knicks fans are saying like, oh, it's Tibbs. What's going on there? Because they're having this great season, but there's also all this, consternation over the minutes and the injuries and their ability to beat Boston. Like, how would you kind of assess where they're at in being able to challenge the Celtics at this point?
Sure, Bobby. I mean, when you look at the Knicks, they right now look like a great regular season team. Going into the playoffs, you kind of touched on a little bit with some of your friends saying about Tom Thibodeau and the rotation and the depth. He's always kept a tight rotation, and it just seems like the concern for people is that they're going to, burn out a little bit going towards the playoffs. But again, that's why I said Jalen's injury, that's going to kind of negate that in terms of having wear and tear on his body. The Josh Hart thing where they were in kind of a shouting match in the huddle, I have to be honest, that's probably the one shouting match I really didn't bat an eye over. They love each other. Like I wouldn't make anything about a beef or anything like that. First of all, Josh Hart plays the most minutes in the league, literally.
Mm-hmm.
So Tibbs loves him on and off the court. And for Josh, at the time, he was struggling offensively. I think there was a little bit of that. And big picture for them, you mentioned about, well, how have they fared specifically against Boston? I do agree with your assessment. It's ironic that they had this kind of wing stop thought that, okay, we're going to get OG Anunoby and have Mikal Bridges to combat Tatum and Brown. But it seemed like last year in the games they were closer. Now, I don't know what that's going to mean for the playoffs, if there's going to be a notch that gets turned on and whatnot. Brunson's going to be the closer for them. In some ways, they've needed Karl Towns to be equally the 1B as a closer, but Brunson takes so much usage. He's just getting a lot of shots at the end of games, in close games during the regular season. So that's something I'm monitoring for the playoffs. Is Karl Towns going to be equally the 1B closer to Jalen Brunson's 1A? I do think their effort level and the gap between them and Boston is going to be shrunk in the playoffs. If not, then I think if you're the Knicks and you design this where you're looking where you can have multiple years, eventually you have to make a decision on Mikal Bridges' extension. You have to then say to yourself, well, we gave up all these picks to get Mikal, but big picture, the goal is now not just to be a great regular season team, not just to get to the second round, it's to get further than that. And so for the Knicks, I think the playoffs, and especially against Boston, could be a real needle-moving point for them.
Yeah, and again, Celtics pretty much locked in at that 2 spot at this point. Knicks would be hard for them to fall to 4. So that does set them on a collision course for a second-round matchup here. Impossible to imagine the Celtics losing round 1. The Detroit thing's interesting. We don't have to get into that, but I do think they could push New York a little harder than many people would think.
They're playing with house money. Listen,
yeah.
Detroit is playing with house money. Nobody thought that they would be this high in the Eastern Conference standings. So credit to Trajan Langdon for bringing in some veterans like Tobias Harris and shooting with Tim Hardaway Jr. and Malik Beasley around those young guys to supplement their growth. But they're playing with house money. And I would also argue that with the Pistons, they've overachieved so much this year that you almost you don't want to almost set unrealistic expectations for next year. You want to continue to keep that trajectory going up and linear. So, if they even lost in the first round, I don't think that's a bad thing. Like, they've had a good year so far. Obviously, they're striving for more, but they're playing with house money.
And talk about something that would drive Knicks fans through the roof, losing round 1 of them. We'll see. There's a lot of movement in the middle of the standings too. Milwaukee, Indiana in that range as well, but it does look like it's going to be Celtics 2, Knicks 3 at this point. The Nets and Celtics are going to play again on Tuesday, and if you're in Boston, this is the last chance the Celtics at home for a while. They're about to go out on their biggest road trip of the season. We'll take them pretty much through the end of the month out there. So if you want to see them this week, got to go over to Game Time and get some tickets for this game on Tuesday night. It was a good one out in Brooklyn, way better than you would have expected between these two teams. So go check it out. It's my favorite app to find tickets, and there's a bunch of great features that make it that way. The biggest one for me is the panoramic views of your seats. If you've never been to an arena, I know Brooklyn down there is a little wacky with the balcony and all that. dark stands there. Like, there's just a lot of good reasons. MSG, if you're thinking about going to that game next month, the seating in there is a little strange too. So you'll see exactly where you're sitting, and a lot of great features on there too. Beyond that, the lowest price guarantee, they'll credit you 110% of the difference over there as well. And your purchase is covered by the most flexible customer service policy in the ticketing industry. All-in pricing also shows you up front what you're going to pay, so there's no surprise fees at checkout. And again, the panoramic view is my favorite part of the app there as well. So go check it out. Concerts, comedy, theater, beyond sports. So there's a bunch of different events you can go to there as well. This isn't just basketball or hockey or baseball coming up here. This is everything over on the Game Time app. So use the code CLNS to get $20 off your first purchase over there. Terms apply. Again, create an account over on the Game Time app. Use the code CLNS and get $20 off your first purchase. What time is it? Game time. So you mentioned the field here, Michael, and I think the biggest thing we've learned this season, I don't know what to make of the Celtics ups and downs and the January they had. And even this game, they're sitting out some guys and you're up 21 and you blow the lead. It's hard to take anything from that given where they're at this point in their season. And the second seed results that they have here, I think, are good enough for anybody. So I don't think anyone has any huge complaints about the season that they've had to this point. But one thing that's clear is there's more competition out there. And you look at what the Cavs are doing. It's outstanding. Even the series against the Celtics with a big comeback in Boston the last time they played a couple weeks ago. So they're 2-2 at this point. Oklahoma, who it's hard to imagine not coming out of the West, even though it's a very crowded, competitive field out there. They beat the Celtics handily twice and pretty much suffocated Boston's offense, which is one of the best in the league, obviously, with that defense that they have there. So they're the one I'm looking at. We saw the game on Wednesday. They found a way to slow all of Boston's role players. In the first game they played in January, they forced a ton of turnovers on the Celtics there. And you just look at the talent level they have across the board there. Obviously, SGA can outplay Tatum on any given night. When Jalen Williams is in the lineup, and he wasn't even in there for that game, he can outplay Jaylen Brown. And then you have the Chet Porzingis thing, the Caruso factor to match what Drew Holiday does. It's almost like they've added a player at every position to match up perfectly with Boston here. So there's no guarantee that that's going to be the finals. But if it is, I think you do have to have some concern if you're Boston, just based on how those two games looked in the regular season.
Yeah, I mean, well, also with Oklahoma City, Isaiah Hartenstein has been sensational for them.
Gives them even more flexibility. Yeah.
Yeah, and Chet's been out, and he's been at times during this year. Chet's been out, and Isaiah's played phenomenally well, averaging a double-double and being efficient offensively. He's a great passer for the center position as well. So he gives them a little bit of offensive diversity, especially operating kind of high-low. And then you've got, with Cleveland in particular, you have a team that has similar continuity. And you mentioned Oklahoma City. Cleveland and Oklahoma City have significant continuity throughout most of the core of their roster, similar to Boston. And I don't think it's a coincidence, Bobby, that those are some of the best teams in the NBA. A lot of times, given the transaction cycles, a lot of teams, we saw it previously with Milwaukee when they got Dame, and the Knicks were getting Bridges. It takes a little bit of time to build the chemistry. And similarly with Minnesota, you make a big trade right before the season with Karl Anthony Towns, and then they get Julius Randle and Dante DiVincenzo. In the beginning, there were a lot of speed bumps, and now they've won 13 in a row when Julius Randle has played for them in Minnesota with him in the lineup. Obviously, that's spaced out over an injury, but the chemistry with him and Rudy Gobert is getting better. So for Boston, Cleveland, Oklahoma City, they already have an inherent advantage going into the playoffs, knowing most of their roster has been together. Sure, Cleveland and Oklahoma City made some upgrades on the margins, and that's not to say they're marginal players, but around the core with Isaiah Hartenstein, they get Caruso in Oklahoma City, and Cleveland gets DeAndre Hunter. For Boston, it's pretty much status quo. The biggest thing for Boston has been the rise of Peyton Pritchard as a Sixth Man of the Year candidate, and truthfully, in my opinion, the leading candidate for the Sixth Man of the Year award.
Yeah, and he broke that bench 3-point record in Brooklyn there, which came pretty early in the schedule. He's going to be able to stack that up even higher. I know Beasley's right behind him there too with it, so he'll probably end up passing Ellington too. But that is a fun race down the stretch, and it feels like Pritchard has it, but he's probably going to have to slam the door, and he'll get the chance to with all the rest that the Celtics are going to do down the stretch here. So Oklahoma scares me if I'm Boston. Cleveland doesn't. But you do have to start to take what they're doing seriously here a little bit. And I know everybody writes it off and says, oh, look at Atlanta that year in 2015. And there's been all these 1 seeds over the years. I think Toronto back around that time, who have these phenomenal regular seasons, but aren't quite the same in the playoffs. But just the amount of wings that they've stacked up, the way that hurt the Celtics in the last game there. And I thought that Hunter move was so awesome. What they gave up. The price they got him for and the impact he's made since. That's exactly what they needed there. A guy who can reach that high level on both ends of the floor that, the Tatums, Browns of the world can. And he's not that kind of player, but he can get there on certain nights. And I think that's played out for them so far. You look at what Mitchell's doing against Boston, his career, he's now the all-time leading points per game scorer against the Celtics, passing Michael Jordan. And then you have all that size out there. So the Mobley thing's the swing one for me. Is he going to play like an all-star in a series against Boston? I think that could steal it for Cleveland. But just based on what we saw in the 4 games, Cavs came back just scrambling from down 20 in both of their wins. But the brunt of those series, the brunt of those games, I'd say, the Celtics were in control. So Celtics have been a great road team. They're going to have to go on the road for that series, obviously, now if it happens. I don't think that's a massive concern to me. So I'd be picking Boston in that series. But the fact that the Cavs have the best offense in the league by a good amount right now, that coach who I think can match up capably with Joe Mazzulla with like the cutting edge philosophies he has, and the fact that they just go out and win every game, like 16 straight, like it's nothing. And almost got 17 straight against Orlando yesterday.
Yeah.
I have to start to take them seriously. I'm not going to pick them in a series over Boston, but you do have to start to take notice.
Oh, if you haven't taken them seriously by now, I think you're doing them a disservice, to be honest. Like Evan Mobley's taken a step forward. You've gotten more consistent, strong play from Darius Garland. And at first, last year with Donovan Mitchell, they needed, it looked like they needed a little bit more cohesion. Kenny Atkinson has got them both playing at a high level. And then we touched on Hunter. We haven't even talked about, I think Cleveland has the best depth overall in the Eastern Conference when you look top to bottom at their roster. You got guys like coming off the bench. You got Max Strus. You got Sam Merrill. Sam Merrill, some nights it's hard for him to get minutes. He's a really good shooter. Just going through their entire lineup, they've got the depth at least to hang in. And that's why I think you've seen in some of the games they've shrunk those deficits against Boston. But to your point, Boston, for the majority of those games, has had the dominant edge and controlled the game for the most part. I'm with you as of today that Boston's coming out of the East, but I do think Cleveland has a legitimate shot to make it a 6+ game series.
Yeah, and I'm looking forward to it. Hopefully it does happen. Anything can happen in the second round there. And, the Cavs are going to have to get through Milwaukee and Indiana too, who both look like at their best conference finalist teams too, potentially there. So I'm not putting them in pen yet in terms of playing in the East Finals, but I'm pretty confident that that's what we're going to be looking at when May comes around. And those games were awesome too. 25-3 becomes a Cavs win in that game in Boston. That was one of the best crowds of the year in Boston as well. And I think that showed more than anything that Boston's starting to take Cleveland a little seriously there, is just how raucous the crowd was that night. So want to hit on one more thing before we get out of here, but first want to shout out PrizePicks. It's a great time of year to head over there and check out the app that makes daily fantasy sports accessible to all. It's so simple. You pick 2 players, pick more or less on their stat projections, and there you go. You have your team for all the great sports happening in March this month. Great to play with your friends. and all kinds of awesome features over there too. Mix and match player projections from different sports. That's an interesting one. Combine your favorite basketball players with players from baseball, hockey, esports, and much more for a shot to win up to 1,000 times your cash. Run your game all season long on PrizePicks with over 10 million members and billions of dollars in awarded winnings over there. The second half of the basketball season's here, and the race to the playoffs is heating up on PrizePicks, the best place to cash in on your favorite sports. So don't miss your chance to cash in as the league's best fight for playoff positioning. You can check out Giannis more or less than 35 points in any given game there. I think Steph's a fun one now too with the Warriors rolling. Always going to pick more on his scoring out there. And again, go over there and use the code CLNS, $50 instantly when you play your first $5 lineup. That's $50 instantly when you play your first $5 lineup with code CLNS. PrizePicks, run your game. So you always put out these great reports, Michael. And the latest one, you've been tracking it all year, the Kevin Durant saga in Phoenix. I watch them every night. I thought they were going to be good this year, and they aren't. And it just seems to be getting worse by the game out there. And even though Dallas is opening this door wide open for them to get into the play-in, you still don't know if they're going to actually step through it and take it here. And like they have to climb a couple more games over the last 10 to 15 here to even get in the play-in. And it doesn't feel like they can win it over some of the other teams out there. So this feels like it's coming to an end. They obviously had his name in a bunch of different trade rumors throughout that deadline process there. It even felt like in the final days leading up to the deadline that a deal was actually going to get done. There was a big Golden State thing that he's talked about, not wanting to go there mid-season. I heard Miami was really close when the Butler saga was, starting to come together there. And it still feels like that would be a possibility over the summer as well, with Miami trying to reshape their roster now. They don't have anything to work around right now on that roster. So 2 things. What's going to happen with Durant this summer, you think? And what does he have left to give a contending team at this point in his career after it just hasn't worked out in Phoenix?
Well, look, Phoenix started the year hot, and then they've gone incredibly inconsistent since. There's been times where it seems like Bradley Beal has been made out to be the scapegoat at times, even though he's offensively been efficient. For Kevin Durant, what does he have to give? I mean, Kevin Durant is still one of the best offensive players in the NBA, unquestionably. And at the end of the day, anytime you walk into an arena with KD, he can go for 30-plus a night. There's something to be said for that, still at his age and coming off the Achilles injury. He's been phenomenal and arguably more efficient, which has been mind-boggling. What do I foresee happening for KD in the summer? Look, certainly Phoenix doesn't want to move Devin Booker. And so they tried to move Bradley Beal. But Bradley Beal having a no-trade clause certainly complicated that, on top of the fact that teams around the league were not pining to take his additional salary going forward. With the new CBA, it makes things a lot tougher. And so for Phoenix, I think it's going to end up being more of a retool a little bit around Devin Booker. And for the next logical piece, Kevin Durant is that guy that could get traded because he's generated enough interest. He'll have a year on his deal. And, you could have tried to make an extension happen, but big picture, he is getting older and it hasn't worked out to this point. So you look around the league going into the playoffs, I can't tell you which team would be a leading contender for him now. And the reason I say that, Bobby, is because in the playoffs, there are going to be teams that underwhelm. And when you underwhelm and there's more pressure, it leads to more desperation to make a move and make something happen, make a splash. Previously over the summer, for example, we saw the Philadelphia 76ers go all in. Paul George, and they made a bunch of other moves. And in some ways, they won the headlines in the offseason, but it hasn't translated on paper. With the Suns and Kevin Durant, previously, I thought it was interesting that Minnesota was one of the top teams aggressively pursuing Kevin Durant. If you're going to be any team that goes and gets Kevin Durant, you're thinking that Kevin Durant is the missing piece. And one of the reasons that partly the talks with the Minnesota Timberwolves fell through, in addition to not just wanting to. One of the reasons it fell through for Minnesota, in addition to not wanting to part with Anthony Edwards and Jaden McDaniels, was that there was a question of, okay, well, if we gut this roster pretty much and we just get Kevin Durant, and you even have Kevin Durant, Anthony Edwards, and Jaden McDaniels, and whatever leftover parts, is that enough? And it's not sustainable at that point, given his age. If you're getting Kevin Durant, you have a short title window. You have maybe a higher ceiling, but a shorter title window. So for teams around the league, I think when the playoffs hit, that's going to be interesting. You touched on Miami, Bobby, and yes, Miami was indeed highly interested in getting Kevin Durant. They had been previously over a number of years. Big picture, I think Kevin's going to ball out in the playoffs, which I think could help his – if they get to the playoffs, I should say. He'll put his best foot forward, and he's been a pro about it. He understands, just like he did when he was in Brooklyn, that it's going to take a lot to trade for him. The Suns aren't just going to give him up. That's not going to happen. So, obviously, there are a lot of eyes on him in the summer, whether they move him or not. Big picture, we'll see, but it's certainly trending towards that possibility growing as the Suns struggle as a team collectively.
Yeah, and going back to the Lillard saga with Miami, you think of the Hero and Robinson and, those packages that they were throwing at Portland that just didn't work. I don't think they'd work necessarily in this spot either. Now Hero's risen to all-star status in Miami, so who knows if he would even be available there. The Minnesota thing's interesting. You understand why the Wolves wouldn't give up Edwards for Durant at this point. Like that doesn't make much sense. So I don't know how they circle back. And you said it's possible that Minnesota does circle back this summer on a deal like that. They've won 8 straight now. The Randall thing's starting to work to some degree. I think they've won 13 straight with him in there. DiVincenzo looks awesome as well. Back from injury, shooting like 43% from 3 cents. So they're starting to figure it out there. And I get that the Durant thing's always appealing. And maybe there's some sort of ownership thing there too, as they transition owners there too, because it was a new owner who obviously spearheaded the Durant move in Phoenix in the first place. So I don't see the enormous need for Durant in Minnesota. And I definitely don't see, outside of Edwards being in that deal, which the Wolves probably won't do, how
that's not gonna happen. The bigger question was if Jaden McDaniels was going to be in the deal. That was kind of a needle moving point, and Minnesota did not want to part with him, from what I was told.
And if that's the case, there's just not going to be a deal there. So I'm looking at Houston, who had a rough stretch there for a little bit this month, got back on a winning streak, and they're going to make the playoffs here in Ime's second season. And there's always been that debate, even going back to last year, of how much do they accelerate this process versus how much do they wait and see with the young guys. They extend Green, they extend Şengün. So, that was never a deal that was going to happen this season. But they went out and got the Phoenix picks from Brooklyn in that weird trade that brought the Durant picks to Houston. And then I remember Woj reporting at that time, like, all right, this might be getting the ball moving toward a Durant deal in Houston. And obviously, I believe Ime was there during Durant's time in Brooklyn. So they have a relationship. It feels like that's the kind of final piece Houston needs to get its offense going more consistently, because we know they're a top-tier defense at this point. That one makes all the sense in the world to me. Now, what players would go to Phoenix in that? Jalen Green, maybe. I think Şengün's probably someone they build around there. I don't know what it would look like, but to me, that's the Durant team, Houston.
As you're mentioning Houston, I'm thinking of a lot of different things in my head. Number one, Ime Udoka, when he was coaching in Boston, was trying to get Kevin Durant. And that was during the Jaylen Brown trade talks. And
you think Ime had a hand in that?
I would say that Ime Udoka coached Kevin Durant, is fond of him, and I think it would be naive to think that he wasn't at least aware of the conversations and gave his input one way or the other.
Mm-hmm.
And now in Houston, look, when they got Fred VanVleet, it was clear to me that any coach is trying to win sooner than later. Now, for Houston, I would say I'm going to say this in general, Bobby, okay? The Kevin Durant market is going to be shaped by what happens with the Milwaukee Bucks and Giannis Antetokounmpo first, in my opinion. And I say that because teams around the league are looking at Giannis first before KD because Giannis is younger. And Giannis has a longer pathway to extending a title window than Kevin Durant. Both are great players, but we're just talking an age difference here. And Giannis obviously on both sides of the ball. So I think that's going to be the first kind of needle moving point. And if you're a team like Houston and you've got young assets, you got to figure out Jabari Smith. What are you going to do with him in an extension? Reed Shepherd, one of your top picks that hasn't really had a chance to play. You got Cam Whitmore, Jalen Green. You have a lot of assets and flexible contracts.
And those Phoenix picks.
You got the picks. You can throw Jock Landale in there. I get the picks, but I would also say to you that if you look at Matt Ishbia and the way he's operated, Matt Ishbia is not worried about picks.
Right.
They broke up the 2031 pick to get multiple first-round picks to help move off of Nurkic, get them closer to ducking and going below the second apron if they can over the summer and giving them more flexibility. That's a different scenario. But big picture, Ishbia is a star-driven guy, big-name-driven guy. That's why he got Durant immediately upon getting control of the team and then going out and getting Bradley Beal too. So we'll see certainly, but I think for Houston and a lot of other teams around the league, Giannis would be ahead of Durant on the pecking order. Now, of course, you have to wait and see what happens. It would take Giannis asking out behind the scenes. And these are a lot of theoreticals, but it's what the league is monitoring. And they've always been monitoring it. But
I was just going to say,
after the Luka trade, anything's possible. I'm telling you now.
Definitely. Yeah, and we have heard that forever. It feels like Giannis does that just to keep Milwaukee on edge to some degree. And the last two playoffs, he's hurt. So they fire Bud. I don't know what they expected out of them with Giannis down in that series, and then all the whole sagas that happened last year with Doc coming in there. They're in an interesting place too. I mean, they just got blown out by Oklahoma last night. They're sort of just floating around the middle of the NBA or the East right now.
Right.
Does it feel more real than ever, that pressure on them to win this year, or the possibility that something could happen with Giannis this summer if they don't?
Well, they certainly tried to improve their chances by going out and getting Kyle Kuzma before the trade deadline and parting ways with Chris Middleton. And so, yeah, I would say there's pressure every year you have Giannis because big picture, anytime you have a star in a market like that, there's always pressure. And the whole league is always going to be waiting to pounce at an opportunity like that. So I certainly think, as I touched on earlier on your show, that the playoffs are going to dictate a lot for Milwaukee in the future going forward. Obviously, they paired Giannis and Dame Lillard together to give themselves a higher ceiling. But ever since the finals, when they won, slowly the trajectory has gone the opposite way. And so I think it's going to be somewhat of a needle-moving point coming up here.
He's Michael Scotto, always a great follow for all the news, rumors, happenings around the NBA, and of course, everything happening down there in New York City as well. Celtics-Nets coming up tomorrow. We will have coverage of that. And again, check out Hoopshype for all of his coverage, as well as his Twitter account there, Mike A. Scotto. Great to have you here, Michael. Always good seeing you, and hopefully we'll see you down the line here somewhere into the playoffs.
Always, Bobby. Keep up the great work as well on your end. It's always good to see you in town, my man.
No one's sneaking a vegan brownie by me, I'll tell you that.
Okay, you know what, John? We're going to do it.
You have to feel that way too, Bobby.
I have to feel that way. Let's
Yeah.
slide out over and make Luke your first center.
Bobby, we gave you Luke hour early. We're not going to end this on a damn conversation about Luke